On a loud street in Uttar Pradesh, a 27-year-old bull elephant named Veer kept walking on scorching concrete, each step a pain he had long since stopped reacting to. When a Wildlife SOS team finally located him after days of covert searching, they deployed something that had never been used in the field before, an ambulance designed specifically for elephants. But nothing could have prepared them for what happened next, not even the people who had spent entire careers rescuing elephants like Veer. This is the story of 27 years of service to humans and the cost of freedom that arrives too late. Before we begin, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and ring the notification bell so you never miss stories like this one. Kartik Satyanarayan had been doing this work for 28 years, long enough to know that some cases stay with you differently from others. At 52, he had co-founded Wildlife SOS in Delhi at a time when almost no one in India was talking systematically about captive elephant welfare. His office walls were covered with field maps, case reports stacked in manila folders, and photographs sent in by volunteers scattered across a dozen states. A quiet archive of suffering that most people never saw. On a Tuesday morning in late February 2026, a new report arrived from a field contact in Uttar Pradesh. One bull elephant male, estimated age late 20s, right front leg compromised, roadside begging circuit in a district outside Lucknow. There was a photograph attached. Kartik had received hundreds of photographs like this over the decades. Elephants on city streets, elephants positioned outside temples for offerings, elephants pressed into narrow traffic lanes with their mahouts balanced on their necks. He had learned eventually to process what he saw with a kind of professional steadiness that allowed him to keep moving from one case to the next without losing the ability to function. It was a skill that nobody in this line of work talked about openly, but everyone had developed in their own way, because without it, the work became impossible. But he looked at this particular photograph for a long time before he set it down. The elephant in the image was not performing any distress that would be obvious to a casual observer. He was simply standing. His head was angled slightly downward, his ears resting flat against his skull. His weight shifted almost imperceptibly to his left side. It was the posture of an animal that had stopped expecting anything to change. Not broken in any dramatic, visible sense, but quietly, thoroughly adjusted to a life that offered nothing worth anticipating. Kartik forwarded the report to the field operations coordinator with a single instruction: begin logistics for retrieval. That bull elephant's name, they would learn later from the paperwork associated with his ownership, was Veer, a Hindi word meaning brave. Veer had been born somewhere in the forests of northern India at a time no living record precisely documents. Elephas maximus. Indicus, the Indian subspecies of Asian elephant, is an animal built for distance, for memory, for a kind of accumulated geographic knowledge that takes years to develop. In the wild, bulls of his species travel between 40 and 60 kilometers a day across terrain that varies constantly. Soft forest floors layered with decomposing leaf matter, riverbanks, and seasonal floodplains. Dry grassland corridors that connect one patch of forest to the next. Their feet are engineered for this variation, cushioned, internally adaptive in their pressure distribution. Designed by millions of years of evolution for ground that gives and shifts and responds to weight. In the wild, a bull of Veer's age would have been navigating the complicated social dynamics of musth cycles of temporary associations with other males, of moving in and out of proximity with family groups across a home range that might span hundreds of square kilometers. He would have known water sources by memory, known seasonal migration corridors, known the smell of the forest at different times of year. At some point, the records are incomplete, the circumstances unclear. Veer was separated from that life. He entered the world of captive elephant commerce, the network of ownership and labor that has existed on the Indian subcontinent for centuries, and which in its modern form still involves thousands of elephants working on city streets, at religious festivals, in logging operations, in the tourist industry. His introduction to that world left no formal documentation. What remained was the evidence written on his body. The work of a begging elephant requires standing for long hours on surfaces that are fundamentally wrong for the anatomy of the animal performing the work. Concrete and asphalt do not give. They push back uniformly and without variation against every step, every shift of weight, every hour of standing through the heat of an Indian afternoon. For 1 year, this produces discomfort. For 5 years, it begins to accumulate into damage. For 27 years, it produces what the Wildlife SOS veterinary team would eventually document in careful clinical language: cracked epithelium subsurface infection, structural deformation of the tissue layers beneath the nail. And what anyone who looked at Veer's right front foot could understand without any medical training at all. He was in pain that had become so consistent and so long-standing that it had ceased to register as pain and had become instead simply the baseline condition of being alive. His daily circuit had not changed in years. The same streets, the same intersections, the same pattern of movement dictated by whoever held his chain on a given day. He had learned the precise weight of that chain. He had learned the exact tension of it, the difference between a slack moment when no demand was being made and a sharp tightening that meant he needed to move in a specific direction immediately. He had learned to consume food quickly when it was offered, and to stand still without shifting when it was not. He had learned over 27 years to compress his needs into the smallest possible space, not as an act of will, but as the accumulated result of a world that did not have room for them. Somewhere in the Corbett forest landscape, several hundred kilometers to the northeast, bull elephants of roughly the same age as Veer were moving through the trees in the late afternoon light, following dry riverbeds down toward water, moving at exactly the pace their own bodies chose. Veer had not done anything at the pace his own body chose in a very long time. When the Wildlife SOS field team first observed him through binoculars from a safe distance on the first day of their covert assessment, they noted something in their preliminary report that the team leader, a field coordinator named Salim, who had spent 11 years doing this kind of retrieval work, would return to in his formal debrief weeks later. Veer did not raise his head when an unusual sound reached him from across the road. A healthy elephant has an involuntary alerting response to unfamiliar auditory stimuli. The ears lift, the head rises, the animal orients toward the source of the sound with a kind of whole-body attentiveness. It is not a learned behavior. It is wired into the species at a level below any training or conditioning present in elephants that have had no exposure to threat, and in elephants that have had considerable exposure to it. Veer had stopped doing it. Whatever mechanism once told him that the unexpected was worth attending to had gone quiet somewhere across 27 years of streets and chains, and the same sounds repeating without variation. The field team observed him for 2 full days before the operation began. They did not approach. They did not make contact. They documented, assessed the legal and logistical parameters of the retrieval, and waited. And on the evening of the second day, Salim wrote a single line at the bottom of his field observation log in the space usually reserved for operational notes. He's been waiting a long time. I don't think he knows he's still waiting. The morning of February 28th, 2026 began before sunrise for the 11 people comprising the Wildlife SOS rescue operation. There were field staff, a legal coordinator, who had spent the previous week working through the documentation required to take formal custody of a privately owned elephant under Indian wildlife protection law, and Dr. Yudaraj Kadpikar, the organization's senior veterinary officer, who had been with Wildlife SOS long enough to have treated more than 30 rescued elephants and to understand precisely what the field photographs of Veer's foot were telling him. He had reviewed Salim's 2-day observational assessment carefully. He had also spent part of the previous evening thinking through the variables specific to this case: the age of the animal, the duration and nature of the injury history, the logistical challenge of a transport that would cover several hundred kilometers on roads that ranged from highway to rural track. The elephant ambulance was loaded and ready by 5:30 in the morning. It was not a vehicle that announced itself dramatically from the outside. A large reinforced transport truck with a modified cargo compartment painted with the Wildlife SOS identification on its panels. But the interior represented years of consultation and iterative design work, a specialized harness and stabilization system engineered to redistribute an elephant's weight across all 4 legs during transit, reducing the load on any single limb. a ventilation and temperature regulation system calibrated for the body mass and metabolic heat output of a large Asian elephant in warm weather. Access panels on both sides allowed Dr. Kadpakar to reach Veer, check his condition, administer medication and water, and monitor his vital signs without opening the main compartment and disrupting the transport environment. It had been tested extensively in controlled conditions. It had never carried a living elephant on a real road toward a real destination. This was its first time. The legal handover process consumed the better part of the morning, conducted with the presence of local officials and requiring signatures on documentation that formalized what the Wildlife SOS team had spent weeks arranging through proper channels. During this process, Veer stood nearby in his usual configuration. Head angled slightly down, chain-attached weight distributed in the habitual asymmetry his body had developed around the damaged right foot. The team moved in his vicinity without hurry, speaking in low voices, allowing him time to register their consistent presence and to find in their movements nothing that required him to respond with alarm. This was deliberate. This was the foundation of what came next. When it was finally time to guide Veer toward the loading ramp that would take him into the ambulance's cargo compartment, he stopped at the base of it. He had never seen anything like it: the angle of the ramp, the smell of the unfamiliar interior, the visual transition from open air into the enclosed space of the compartment. None of it corresponded to any stored experience. The team did not push. They waited. After several minutes, Veer's right ear lifted slightly, a movement so small that someone not watching carefully would have missed it entirely. Then he walked up the ramp. The compartment door closed behind him. The convoy pulled out onto the road, heading south toward Mathura. And the most difficult portion of Veer's rescue began, not the part that anyone watching from the outside would have recognized as such, but the part that Dr. Kadpakar understood immediately and had been preparing himself to manage for the duration of the drive. Veer could not lie down. This was not a decision anyone made on his behalf. It was a consequence of physics applied to the biology of a 4-ton animal in a moving vehicle. An elephant on the ground in a confined space during braking and acceleration. Even careful braking, even measured acceleration, is an elephant at risk of injury from the momentum of its own mass. The harness system was designed to transfer pressure away from Veer's damaged foot by distributing his weight more evenly across all 4 legs. It helped in a meaningful clinical sense. It was not a solution to the fundamental fact that he was standing on a damaged limb for the length of a multi-hour drive. The convoy stopped every 90 minutes. At each stop, Dr. Kadpakar came down from the cab and went directly to the access panels on the side of the ambulance. He checked Veer's heart rate, monitored the temperature inside the compartment, assessed the foot through the lower access point, and offered water through the forward panel. At the first stop, Veer did not drink. At the second stop, Veer did not drink. He stood in the interior of the moving ambulance, the ventilation system running the muffled road noise present around him, and his ears moved in the slow, irregular pattern that indicated low-level sustained stress. He was not in crisis. He was enduring. It was a distinction the team recognized from their experience with other elephants who had come from long captivity histories. Animals who had learned across years of having no effective way to express distress to make themselves very quiet around it. Animals who had discovered that reaction changed nothing and had adjusted accordingly. At the third stop, Dr. Kadpakar extended the water vessel through the forward access panel as he had done at the 2 previous stops. Veer turned his head. He reached his trunk toward the panel and drank, not rapidly, not urgently, but with a slow deliberateness that was different from the behavior of an animal consuming something before it could be removed. It was a small thing. No one commented on it out loud. The convoy had 4 hours remaining to Mathura. The team returned to their vehicles and drove. But in the follow vehicle, Salim wrote 1 line in his field log at that stop below the clinical notations. He drank on his own terms. The light was going golden and flat when the convoy turned onto the access road leading to the Elephant Conservation and Care Center on the edge of Mathura. 31 rescued elephants lived here in varying stages of recovery from varying histories. Some recent arrivals still learning what it meant to not be compelled to do something at all hours. Some long-term residents who had been here for years and whose behavior had shifted in ways the staff could document but not entirely explain. As the ambulance passed through the main gate, sounds moved across the compound in the early evening air. Low rumbles. The particular frequency of elephant communication that carries further than it seems to, that moves through the ground as much as through the air. Inside the ambulance, Veer's ears changed. Not slightly this time, fully both of them rising to their full alert position in the involuntary orientation response that had been absent on the street in Uttar Pradesh. He heard them. He heard other elephants. What that registered as in his nervous system. Whether it activated something ancient and stored from before the decades of pavement. Whether it connected to any sequence of memory from the life he was born into is not something the team could measure or the science can currently answer. But his ears were up, and that was not nothing. The ramp was lowered at 7:38 in the evening. Dr. Kadpakar stood to one side and waited. It took Veer several minutes to move toward the opening. He stood at the interior edge of the ramp, processing the new information coming in from outside, the smells of the compound, the sounds of the other elephants settling for the evening, the quality of the air. He stepped down the ramp, slowly placing each foot with the deliberate caution of an animal managing real pain in one limb. When his right front foot reached the ground at the base of the ramp, he stopped. He stood completely still. The ground was soft, compacted earth over the natural substrate of the compound. Not concrete, not asphalt, not the rigid, returning surface his feet had pressed against for 27 years. There was no sound from Veer. There was no dramatic physical response. He simply did not lift the foot. He stood on it, on ground that gave fractionally beneath his weight, and did not move for a long, still moment, while the compound settled into its evening sounds around him. Dr. Kadpakar wrote in his clinical log at 7:42 p.m. Veer, first contact with soft ground. Standing steady. No distress indicators. None of the 11 people who had driven from Uttar Pradesh that day called it a small thing. The full veterinary assessment took the better part of 2 days to complete. Dr. Kadpakar and the facility's medical staff worked methodically through every system. The feet in detailed joint function and range of motion, skin condition across the full body surface, nutritional status, dental health, eye function, parasite load. What they found in the right front foot confirmed and extended what the field photographs had suggested. The damage was not a single injury or a collection of recent ones. It was layered old insults over older ones' tissue that had been stressed and partially healed and stressed again across such a long timeline that it had reorganized itself around the damage rather than recovering from it. There were areas of deep tissue involvement that would require months of consistent daily treatment before the medical team could make an accurate assessment of how much function might ultimately be recoverable. There was a real possibility, documented carefully in the initial clinical report, that the foot would never return to full normal function. The team understood this. They had understood it as a likelihood before Veer arrived. It did not change what the next day's treatment looked like or the day after that. Treatment began the morning following arrival and continued without interruption from that point forward. The daily protocol involved soaking and careful cleaning of the affected foot in medicated solution, the application of therapeutic dressings, oral and topical anti-inflammatory medication calibrated to Veer's body weight, and systematic observation of how he distributed his weight and moved through his designated area as the days accumulated. The protocol also involved mud. Mud baths are not a comfort preference for Asian elephants in the way that a warm bed might be a comfort preference for a domesticated animal. They serve specific physiological functions. Thermoregulation for a species with limited ability to sweat, protection against sun damage for sensitive skin, pest control against insects that target the thinner skin behind the ears and around the eyes. Elephants in conditions that prevent regular access to mud develop skin problems. The absence of mud is in the clinical sense a deprivation with measurable consequences. Veer had not had regular access to mud in a very long time. He approached the mud pool in his area on the second day with the hesitation of an animal whose body retained the instinct but whose experience had not reinforced it in so long that it no longer moved toward the thing automatically. He stood at the edge for a while, reading the situation. Then he stepped in. The first week was defined by patterns the staff watched carefully and documented without intervening in. Veer ate thoroughly, and without the speed that captive elephants often develop when food access has been inconsistent or conditional. The kind of rapid consumption that speaks to a learned expectation that what is available now may not be available later. He moved through his enclosure area at whatever pace suited him at any given hour, which varied. He investigated things with his trunk in the particular unhurried way that indicates an animal not operating under urgency. And at night, recorded by the facility's monitoring equipment, he began lying down to sleep. The first night the monitoring system captured Veer Recumbent, the staff member, reviewing the overnight footage in the following morning, noted it to Dr. Kadpakar in a way that was factual but not quite neutral. On soft ground, the simple act of lying down becomes possible again for an animal who has been unable to do it comfortably for years. The notation went into the daily log under behavioral observations. 3 weeks after Veer's arrival, Kartik Satyanarayan flew from Delhi to Mathura. The operational demands of running an organization that managed elephant welfare cases across multiple Indian states meant that he was rarely able to be present at the facility in person. He stood outside the observation area in the early morning with a cup of tea and watched Veer move through the far side of his enclosure, heading in a slow, even arc toward the mud pool in the low light. The right front leg still carried less weight than the others. The compensation in the gait was visible if you knew what you were watching for, but he was moving more evenly than the arrival footage had shown. Kartik watched for a while without saying anything to the staff members standing nearby. Wildlife SOS had set a formal organizational target of locating and rescuing every begging elephant in India before the year 2030. It was a goal that required acknowledging the full scale of what remained thousands of elephants still in working captivity across the country, distributed across state jurisdictions with different legal frameworks and different levels of enforcement. Each case requiring its own documentation, its own negotiation, its own chain of logistical decisions. The organization had been working toward this target for years. They had rescued 31 elephants. The number of elephants still on the streets was not 31. Each of those remaining cases was an animal whose body carried the record of however many years the streets had written on it, and something prior to all of that. Something that preceded the chain and the concrete entirely. Veer would not return to the forest. An elephant whose entire adult life has been shaped by captive conditions cannot simply be placed in a wild landscape and expected to navigate it. That window had closed long before the ambulance arrived. The facility in Mathura was his home now. It was not the life he was born into. It was also not the chain and the asphalt and the January heat on a roadside outside Lucknow. In the weeks that followed the assessment period, the staff began noting a behavior that Veer engaged in most afternoons, when the temperature began to drop toward the cooler part of the day. He would move without apparent urgency and without being directed to a particular section of his enclosure near the outer fence. An area where the grass grew somewhat taller, where the tree line beyond the facility boundary was visible through the wire. He would stand there quietly, sometimes 30 minutes, sometimes considerably longer. He was not agitated in those periods. He was not vocalizing, not moving restlessly, not exhibiting any of the stereotypic behaviors that signal chronic stress in captive elephants. He was simply present in that particular spot in a way that seemed to the people observing him qualitatively different from the way he occupied any other part of his area. Dr. Kadpakar was careful in his professional practice about the narratives people attached to animal behavior. There were documented evidence-based explanations for most of what elephants do. And there were things that remained genuinely uncertain and collapsing. That distinction did not serve the animals or the science. But he watched Veer stand in that corner on a Wednesday afternoon in late March. Ears slightly forward, facing the tree line, still in the long shadows of the late day. And he wrote something in the daily behavioral log that was slightly outside his usual clinical register. He wrote, "I think he is remembering something, or perhaps learning how to remember again." Veer had waited 27 years, not because he was patient by nature, not because waiting was something he had chosen in any meaningful sense. He waited because the chain was present and the concrete was present, and nothing across 27 years of streets had suggested that waiting would produce anything other than another day. Exactly like the one before. Now, each afternoon when the light changed, he walked to that corner on his own. No instruction had been attached to it. No reward had shaped it into a pattern. He went because something in him moved in that direction when the conditions were right. Because there was apparently still something in him that moved toward anything at all that had not been entirely organized out of existence by the decades. And for an elephant who had lived his entire adult life without a single movement that was wholly and only his own, perhaps that was the most honest definition of freedom that the situation permitted. Not the forest, not the life he was born for. Just this, the quiet choice to stand in one particular corner facing the trees for exactly as long as he wanted, and no chain anywhere to say otherwise.